Bueno, Vivi, adelante.
Bueno, good afternoon, buenas tardes. Good afternoon and thank you for being here with us today. Voy a hacer la introducción en inglés para ROTRAUT y ustedes ya nos conocen, así que no nos tienen que sufrir esa parte y después vamos a la presentación. My name is Vivian Secco and I'm a training analyst at the Argentine Psychoanalytical Association and a team member of the Candidates Culture Group that is led by Matías Luzuriaga. Also in the team are Enrique Carrión, Marta Miraballes, Guerrero, Paula Galak, and Pedro Boari. And always contributing Carolina Lázaro de Czernieki and Juan Buccheri. I would like to thank also Teresa Rux in advance for her generous support for this activity. We have the honor of introducing Mrs. ROTRAUT de Clerck. She's a renowned psychoanalyst of the German Psychoanalytical Association and has been a long-term guest of the British Psychoanalytical Society. Her work intersects notably psychoanalysis with culture and the public discourse. She has carried out the Psychoanalysis Literature and Literature in Psychoanalysis series in Frankfurt, fostering dialogues between contemporary writers and Freud's text. Leclerc's clinical interests include theories on the dynamic interplay of narcissism and object loss, the unconscious, and changes in sexuality, including homosexuality, neosexualities, and the concept of masochism. She's made psychoanalytical portraits of Albert Camus, Virginia Woolf, and painters like Maria Lesnick and Lucian Freud. Her recent projects focus on the place of sexuality in psychoanalytical theory and the practice today. Welcome, ROTRAUT. If you would like to start.
Thank you, Vivian. Thank you very much. I would like to thank you also for presenting all my activities. I'm always surprised myself what I'm doing. It's kind of nice to hear it from the outside, because sometimes I'm unaware that I'm doing so much. But I would like to highlight also that I'm continuing this work that I've done at the Literaturhaus in Frankfurt now with the EPF. I have a group there, an internationally composed group of psychoanalysts, and we're dealing with literature and psychoanalysis. And this is ongoing, and it's a great pleasure. For Dresden, which will be the next EPF Congress, you know, Dresden in Germany, former East Germany, so historically rather charged city. We will talk on The Tin Drum by Günter Grass. You might know the novel, or you might have seen the movie, which is excellent, by Volker Schlöndorff. Anyway, I would love to meet some of you there again in Dresden if you come to our panel.
Bueno, les encantaría encontrarse con ustedes en Dresden si es que van al panel que va a presenciar. Va a estar hablando sobre textos y parece una película de Günter Grass, que está muy agradecida de estar acá y que le parece lindo escuchar cómo es presentada por otras personas, y por lo que dijo antes tiene mucho interés en saber qué opinamos nosotros sobre su trabajo.
Yeah, again, I want to thank you for this invitation. I said it already to the smaller group before. I feel rather honored. I feel that it is a very good thing that we as analysts get together across the generations, especially in the field that interests me, sexuality and how it is in the process of change. We need to turn to the younger generation and be instructed by them and their ideas and their practices. And it is not as though we as the elder generation had nothing to contribute, but it is very fruitful to have a dialogue and to continue talking in the future to understand better where we stand in terms of our culture and, I would say, our instincts and drives.
Ok, dice que está muy honrada de estar teniendo este diálogo, que espera que sea a través de las generaciones, que han habido muchos cambios en la sexualidad, que espera nuevas ideas sobre esta nueva generación, pero que las generaciones que nos preceden también tienen mucho para aportar.
Yes, and in this sense, I'm not bringing you any answers to the area, but rather want to encourage dialogue. And I'm looking forward to your questions and your comments, and I hope that we will have a good and comprehensive discussion.
No tengo respuestas, más vale quiero abrir preguntas, espero que tengamos un fructífero intercambio y que lo podamos aprovechar al momento. Would you like to expose your ideas?
Yes, I could start now. My ideas are based on a podcast that has been distributed by the IPA in the Talks on Psychoanalysis series. It is pretty much the same. I'm looking for dialogue on those points that I'm raising. You will see what they are. I'm sure there would be more, but I have selected a few areas where I think that we need reflection upon. So I will start, if you agree, and I will try to be as clear and as good as possible. How's it now? Can you hear me well?
Yes. Yes.
And can you understand? Am I slow enough? I'll try to be slow.
ROTRAUT, you're super fast and we are trying to keep your rhythm and we like it this way. You continue like that, it's fine.
Okay, fine. So the title of my contribution today is The Place of Sexuality Today. Oh.
We're going to be sharing what you are going to say in Spanish.
In Spanish.
Yes.
I don't see your faces then. Could you put it away from me because I cannot understand the text anyway. Do you understand what I mean? Could I continue to see the audience rather than the text?
Can we do that, Matías?
Pero si saco el texto, la gente no lo va a ver.
If he takes the text, people won't be able to read it. If not, we can, you know what we do, ROTRAUT, if it's okay with you, we do small paragraphs and I try to translate.
No, it's fine. It's fine. It's okay it's probably better if they can read it, then it gives them already more possibility to formulate questions later. So I'll live with it. It's not, I can see you on the side in little, like on postcard.
After you finish your presentation, I will take away the text so you will be able to see everybody again.
Okay, very good.
You may click up in the left side. It's written meeting. If you click there, you are not going to see.
Thank you, Julio. On the right-hand side.
Yeah.
I don't see it. It is something written here. It says compactier. No?
Oh, on the top. I think Julio meant on the top. It says Zoom Workplace,
on the top.
meeting, and then Matías Luzuriaga's screen. If you click in meeting.
Well, I'm too uncertain to do something that, so maybe we just go on. It's fine. I can see you in little.
Yes, like, don't worry. After
like
you finish.
I can see you like stamps at the side. So.
Okay. So after you finish, I will take away the text and you will be able to see us, everybody again.
The title of my presentation is The Place of Sexuality Today. Can we observe a disappearance of sexuality in psychoanalytic treatment and training case reports and supervisions? Question mark. I read the abstract to you. The starting point of my paper is Sigmund Freud's view that sexuality lies at the roots of the neurosis and thus at the origins of psychoanalysis. His successive elucidation of unconscious or repressed sexual material was a moment of progress in the treatment of his patients. In recent years, reports have appeared periodically in the media about an increase in sexual dysphoria amongst the people from the younger generation, in spite of the omnipresence and greater permissiveness towards sexuality in society. This contradiction raises questions for psychoanalysts. Is such a development also reflected in psychoanalytic case reports? And further, could it mean that the problems around sexuality are pushed to the margins in psychoanalytic theory and training? Is sexuality even losing its central position within psychoanalytic theory and practice? Can Freud's theory of drives still be considered a relevant reference point when thinking about sexuality? Against the backdrop of our clinical experience, we as psychoanalysts can start to think whether such a diagnosis of the times is true from our perspective and discuss to what extent it is reflected in supervisions and treatment reports of candidates across the psychoanalytic institutions. Could you move the text a bit higher, then we can look at a painting by Lucian Freud? Is it possible to move it higher up? Yeah, there we are. So I chose this image to display the idea of sexual dysphoria that I have just mentioned in my text. It is called Hotel Room, Paris, 1958. You all know Lucian Freud, I assume. He's the grandson of Sigmund Freud. His father was an architect, and it is said that he inherited the ability to draw from this architect father. But of course, he does much more than just drawing, but it might be a backdrop to the fact that he was at a period when abstractionism was coming on, that he was staying with representational painting. Another idea I was having to this is that.
Sorry, I have to go slowly.
Okay. Do you need to translate that? Well, I will be shorter
it's
then.
Not in the text. Este es un cuadro de Lucian Freud.
It's just a comment on Lucian Freud, and in case you were not so familiar with his works, and to explain why I chose him to illustrate my ideas.
Lucian Freud es nieto de Freud, es bisnieto de Freud, es hijo de arquitecto, hace esta obra, entre otras, que se llama Cuarto de Hotel, que es de París de 1958. Why did you choose him, ROTRAUT? Why do you want to show us this painting? ¿Por qué nos querés mostrar esta pintura?
It will be in my text a little bit.
Okay, ahora viene en el texto.
Why I chose him. First of all, of course, because of the familiarity of Lucian with Freud's ideas. And also he comes from the same family. And my idea is that he put into painting what his grandfather put into words, into theory, but certainly a lot of it in his case histories.
Mi hipótesis, dice ROTRAUT, es que Lucian Freud pone en imágenes lo que el padre pudo poner en palabras y en hipótesis. El abuelo. Continue, please.
When the director of training asked me if I could think of giving a paper on the disappearance of sexuality in the case report, oh no, I have to start here. My thinking on the subject came about against the backdrop of the Supervisors in Training Analysis Conference in Cologne. We have an annual conference on training. The participants shared a new concern that work on sexuality was very little referred to in the case reports that the candidates need to write for qualification to becoming a full analyst and member of the DPV. It started me to ask around in other psychoanalytic institutions if they observed the same trend. We had the opportunity to get a more overall picture from the situation in the European societies, as well as for the other regions in the IPA, as today for Latin America. When the director of training asked me if I could think of giving a paper on, and I'm quoting, the disappearance of sexuality in the case reports and the supervisions of the candidates, and further, quote again, in contemporary psychoanalysis as a whole, with my thinking on sexual fantasies, sexual identity, sexual relationships, and sexualization in trauma in the mirror of the supervisions, I first recoiled. The field seemed too broad, too complex, too controversial also, and too topical. Why too topical? Because sexuality nowadays is so charged with speculations about the zeitgeist that objective assessment is difficult to obtain. We ourselves, as psychoanalysts, are affected by today's landslide in the area of sexuality in the same way as our students and our patients, crushing our so far familiar approaches. Surprising phenomena arise. According to an online sex podcast by Die Zeit, a German, very important periodical, the article was called Sex in the Media, and other reports, the sexual activity of young people today is decreasing instead of increasing. One of the articles was captioned with a picture that made me the most impression. A neatly dressed Asian couple lay motionless on top of each other, seemingly not knowing what to do with each other in this position. If there should be a volatilization of the sexual, after a word by the Swiss anthropologist and psychoanalyst Paul Parin, how then do the two sides of the coin, a liberalization in the field of sexuality, along with the noisy, large-scale media dissemination of sex on one hand, and the de facto decline in the sexual activity of individuals on the other, fit together? Is it even so? And if, how does this apparent contradiction also show up in the material of the patients, in the case reports of the candidates, and in the mirror of supervisions? Or could it maybe precisely be this seeming contradiction which makes it difficult to put the matter of the sexual into words? In fact, the idea of the listlessness of the sexes on one another has been circulating since the 1960s, the times of the student revolt. Sexuality was primarily attributed to narcissistic motives, promoted as a merchandise in a capitalist consumer society, being more easily to satisfy and less dangerous, that is, involving less anxiety, less guilt, and less shame than libidinally driven sexuality. One of the forerunners to these ideas was Raimund Reiche from Frankfurt, and also Volkmar Siegusch. They were working at the Institute of Sexual Research at the University Clinic in Frankfurt. I have myself found it necessary to make a conceptual distinction between sex and sexuality when turning to Lucian Freud's paintings to find a criterion for differentiating between pornography and art. I was pressed by such parts of the public then who despise the obsessive display of naked women and men in Lucian Freud's paintings without understanding the meaning. Namely, that sex is a rather harmless because superficial momentary process, whereas sexuality is an involvement that encompasses the entire person, body and soul as a whole. Sexuality, then, is a lifelong project, spanning from infancy to old age, a task, a challenge with the possibility to fail. This is a truly shocking. Lucian Freud put it into painting what his grandfather Sigmund Freud found words for in the narratives of his case studies as we know them. Anna O, Dora, the rat man, the wolf man. Please go down again to look at the Lucian Freud's pictures. Yeah. Okay. So the Anna O, the Dora, the rat man, the wolf man, and adorable little Hans. So I made a selection from Lucian Freud's paintings to illustrate how for Lucian Freud, sexuality is in all stages of human life. In the first beginning, in the first days, you notice that the breast is almost all bigger than the size of the head of the little baby. You see the young boy of maybe 8 or 9 or 10, absorbed by his thinking, feeling. You could interpret that. You see anxiety in his face.
Entonces hice una pequeña selección del trabajo de Lucian Freud para ver cómo la sexualidad es un proceso que es un desafío de toda la vida. Como ven en el primer cuadro, el pecho es más grande que el bebé. Después vemos un chico de unos 8 o 10 años pensado, concentrado, cuestionándose.
Thank you, Vivian. Could you move further up to look at the other paintings? Yeah. There you see Lucian Freud himself in his atelier in 2005, in the middle of his manhood, of his strength, his competence, his vigor.
Acá pueden ver en su atelier en el 2005, es un retrato de sí mismo con su masculinidad, su potencia, pintando, el cuadro de la izquierda, y después
his aptitude to handle the pencils and the colors. And then he doesn't spare us with a look on the old painter, the old man himself, holding up his, I don't know the English word, it's the thing that you need for scraping the paint.
Ok, entonces en la última imagen lo vemos a Lucian Freud ya mayor, mostrando su cuerpo tal cual es, con esa cosa que se usa para sacar el exceso de pintura, como si fuese una espátula.
Thank you. So I go on. Now I look at various aspects of the subject of changes of the sexual in today's society. First of all, changes in society itself. Under the keyword oversexed and underfucked on the social construction of lust, the sociologist Iris Oswald Ringer explains the apparent paradox. The more society as a whole loses its cultural roots with the sexual drive, the more flashy are the images that appear on the scene. In consequence, the expectations to perform are too high. Anxiety dominates over lust. Desire vanishes. In other words, living in an oversexed world makes us numb from the bombardment by the media with sex and nudity. We may ask, is it indeed the case that lust is disappearing? Would then the disappearance of sexuality from the candidate's case reports not only be a consequence, a reflection of a more general society trend? The answer seems more complex. It starts out by raising the fundamental question, what actually do we as psychoanalysts consider as sexual? What is sexuality to our understanding, and what are the sexual contents? What is the role that we attribute to fantasies, or to the material body? What are the issues that come up in the treatment, and how can we as analysts talk about sex and sexuality? How is sexuality shaped more than 100 years after Freud in the intimate exchange between patients and analysts? and a change technique under the prevalent influence of transference countertransference analysis. Dealing with sexuality amongst colleagues involves sharing concepts. In the previous years, it was most obvious to attach sexual identity to the binary difference of the primary genitals, male, female. This conceptualization today is in the process of being completely dissolved. This began already in the 60s, the time of my training. When a feminist supervisor of a very difficult case asked me if I believed that the body was destiny, I then mumbled a muffled, "Of course not," but I felt left alone with my case. At the same time, another supervisor, a man, asked me if I could not, in the cavities of my patient's neck, so-called salt cellars, these are this part of the neck, and when it's rather deep, it's called salt cellars, Salzkeller in German.
Clavicula.
What is it called?
I think it's clavículas, if you're referring to this bone.
Yes.
No, en alemán se dice saleros. Saleros son los pechos planos. Yo fui la que le corregí esa traducción.
Do you also have this idea of attributing it to the body, that of that body part? So it sounds rather derogatory to my ears, but maybe that was not the origin. I don't know. But anyway, he asked me if I could not, in the cavities of my patient's neck, detect a rejection of the female role. I couldn't, and I also felt left alone with my case. The times of the 60s in Germany marked the beginning of this landslide that we're talking about. We have today moved from a fixed concept of sexual identity to a fluid one. However, it may be that we rather moved from a certain interpretation of Freud's texts with a focus on hierarchy and authority, expressed in the idea of the primacy of genitality, which bundles or partial drives, to a new, more flexible perspective. That is an idea that we can follow up if it was not also an interpretation of Freud's texts that led to a certain perception of the authority of the primacy of genitality. We could have taken already from Freud's studies on hysteria that sexuality is a fluid concept, vexing. It often enough comes in new forms and in unexpected disguises. Such disguises are the work of the unconscious, defenses against anxiety, guilt, and shame. They need to be understood in their particularity, like this costume for this individual. To this aim, Freud used the technique of interrogation, as he said, an unsparing elucidation of the symptom. His attitude was analogous to that of a doctor who is used to looking for a causal relationship of the illness. Freud's professional self-image was first that of a medical doctor, then as an archaeologist, but then also of a novelist. Throughout his work, he brought to light the significance of language for understanding and the therapeutic process. In the Dora case, Freud takes up one of her symptoms after another to explain its content as autoerotic sexual activity. He constructs a line from Dora's investment of her, as he calls it, sensitive lip zone. Freud reports us that Dora was a thumbsucker, making reference to earliest erotic pleasures of nipple and mouth. Only then to move on to the adolescent fantasy about the intercourse of Dora's father with Frau as a fellatio ad os. And then to come back in retrospect to the recognition that Dora was in homosexual love with Frau, hence we can assume returning to the earliest forms of erotic satisfaction with the breast nipple, a very vivid example of après coup. Freud described a chain of interweavings of bodily and psychic functioning mediated by unconscious fantasy. He deducted the link between a former and a later phenomenon of psychic logic, expecting to arriving at the end on a logical link between symptom and inner unconscious conflict by both theoretical understanding on the part of the analyst and so-called insight on the part of the patient. I now have a look at changes in technique regarding Freud's technique that I have outlined, although I have to say this is basically his first writings, and in his later works there are different positions. Today we understand that the logic of a sexual investment of a body part, a symptom, a fantasy or dream, needs not to be unearthed. Freud used at one time for his technique of interrogation the word entreißen. That means, it is a German word that means tear the secrets away from Dora. He mentioned that in the Dora case. We rather understand that a symptom needs to be rediscovered in its meaning again and again by a more flexible method. We know that it was his rigid technique to make Dora flee from the treatment with Freud. She could not trust a father figure, and she wanted to keep her secrets to herself, her longing for a breast, not a penis. So, how do we psychoanalytically deal today with a sexual problem, a sexual symptom in recognition of the impact of complex fantasies? Should one undress the fantasies, as Freud thought, completely trace them back to naked, to their origins, and verbally communicate to the patient what one has found? Does that lead anywhere? Does it not just increase the resistance? Aren't the pitfalls not too big and too numerous, as Freud experienced himself with Dora? To my mind, Freud entangled himself here, on one hand by proclaiming the unconsciousness of the material, and on the other hand by trying to get at it by a technique still close to conscious insight. Freud was forced to experience, in the case of Dora, how one meaning conceals another, and behind it yet another, or its opposite, and that the meanings he found were possibly not what he thought was meant, but a reflection of his own projections. Today, with a method of understanding the scene that is an approach to psychoanalytic material that was developed in Frankfurt, and if you like, we can go more into depth in the discussion, but it is something I was raised on, and very crudely speaking, it resembles transference, countertransference processes, but it leaves more room for the factual, for the material reality that is in the scene between the patient and the analyst. But as I said,
Entonces después podemos desarrollar, porque una de las cosas que ella agrega es la idea de comprender la escena, que fue como ella fue formada, ella y con los 60 antes, que tiene que ver con la transferencia y la contratransferencia, además de con el material que trae el paciente. Pero que después, si quieren, podemos desarrollar ese tema.
Gracias. So, understanding the scene, that's one approach, and close transference, countertransference analysis. Today, we have more subtle tools for understanding the unconscious meaning of a disorder. However, we have to accept that the foundations for understanding the role of fantasies in our Sexualleben were laid by Freud with the help of a scientifically oriented method. Sexuality, I maintain, is still at the roots of psychoanalysis today, and hence of the neurosis. Time has not changed this. The Oedipus complex has not dissolved. We may discuss that. For Freud, however, two important premises applied that are no longer self-evident today and not shared by everyone. And one is the libidinal drive nature of sexuality, the drive nature of sexuality with the Oedipus complex at the center, and related to this, the central importance of repression in all fields of human activity, also in society. With his writings, Freud did not only provide enlightenment in clinical psychoanalysis. To him, the scientific and social benefit of his work was often enough his primary concern. For him, the task of naming repression and sexual conflict as the causes behind pathological symptoms in a broader sense was even more urgent, because he was interested in showing not only the individual, but also the collective denial in society, including the denial of the consequences of sexual repression for our civilization, in the upsurge and dominance of aggression, leading to war and destruction. In addition to his individual case histories, as with Dora, I named the already Dora, Little Hans, and the others, he also contributed with his cultural works to a more profound understanding of society as a whole. With my next point, I turn to language. What language? I just want to say at the side that it seems to myself obvious that I turn to literature in following something that Freud already started in his work. Words, speech, writing was extremely important to the development of the whole body of his work.
Las palabras, el discurso, el texto fueron primordiales para Freud para desarrollar la teoría.
And the talking cure, of course, is a vivid example of his belief in the power, the healing power of words.
Y también entonces la cura por la palabra, the talking cure, para poder resolver los problemas.
So how to talk then? How do we write about sexuality? The most complex and most mysterious subject there is, involving at the same time the body and the psyche in their interrelatedness, inner and outer reality, and the role of fantasy. Not everybody is a master of language, as Freud was, and we, with the multiplicity of theories, have as psychoanalysts lost a common language. Could this also have an influence on the conceptualization of the patient's illnesses and possibly have an effect on the central place of Freud's theory in the psychoanalytic landscape on the whole? These are our questions when we look at the place of sexuality in psychoanalysis today. With the disappearance of the diagnosis of hysteria being largely replaced by traumatic reaction and other diagnostics, we might today not classify Dora as a hysteric. We may see her traumatization in the foreground, the deception by her father, who used her by driving her into the arms of her car in order to justify his own erotic involvement with Frau K. Also, in psychoanalytic therapeutic work today, the focus would no longer be on making repressed sexual content conscious. It is more on such processes that lead to a change in the person as a whole, in his relations with others, a process of growth which is based in the development of the therapeutic relationship between two people, patient and analyst. However, what can we see as the effects of such changes is that the lack of direct sexual reference in the material is related to a shift of attention by moving sexuality to the margins. This seems the trend in psychoanalytic training today, and it could account for the disappearance of sexuality in the mirror of supervisions and the case reports of the candidates. Now, next, a comment on the universality of the Oedipus complex and inherent conflict. When I continued to deal with the question about sexuality today, I myself successively remembered 3 classic papers that have accompanied me up to now from my own training. Firstly, Freud's already mentioned work from 1905, Fragments of a Case of Hysteria, that Isadora case. Furthermore, his work, A Child is Beaten, Contribution to the Knowledge of the Origins of Sexual Perversions, from 1919. And thirdly, the work by Moses Laufer on the central masturbation fantasy, with the title, The Central Masturbation Fantasy, the Final Sexual Organization and Adolescence. These works all reflect the emergence and development of sexual fantasies out of the Oedipal situation, beginning in early childhood and continuing into adolescence, and they contribute to an understanding of the conflicts in adult sexuality, which now include the operation of the mature genitals. Added to this was my experience in high frequency analysis with a young man addicted to internet pornography, a work which I have discussed with colleagues in various contexts and published under various headings. It raises in particular the question whether media images have replaced, displaced, or at any rate changed the form and content, the form and content of sexual fantasies today. It considers it as questionable whether sexuality actually has disappeared from the candidates' representations of their cases, or whether these are new forms in which sexuality disguises itself. I am thinking of the increase in bulimia, in anorexia, cutting, self-mutilations, and affectations of the skin in young girls and adolescents. We may add the wave of sex-changing operations, which may be seen as the expression of a historical conflict, an avoidance of working through a most painful process, and where the fantasies behind remain unearthed due to the unavailability of suitable psychoanalytic concepts or their blunt rejection by a majority of people. There are societal influences that reduce the desire for genital sexual activity, be it the flooding with the images of sexual content, be it physical exhaustion, be it other causes such as physical intrusion. I think of the kiss of Hanka in the case of Dora. Further humiliation or manifest attacks. However, it is a merit of psychoanalysis and thus of Freud to have emphasized the significance of fantasies for sexuality and put the sensation of pleasure and its inhibition in the body at the very center of his theory. It is above all due to the conflictual natures of the Oedipus situation, inducing fears, feelings of guilt and shame, and the defenses against them, that the symptoms arise and remain persistent in the individual and in our culture. According to Freud, then, quote, these feelings of anxiety, guilt, and shame result from, in the words of Freud, drive-bound nature of the inherently conflictual Oedipus situation, and they are therefore, and this is true, it is remarkable what Freud says here, is they are therefore, as Freud said, only conditionally dependent on the surrounding social conditions. This strong statement opens the door to an understanding of the origins of the above symptoms cited as hysteric even today, although, as said, as diagnosis, it seems almost completely to have vanished in favor of the diagnosis of a traumatic development and other forms put into the ICD-10 diagnosis system. If taken up by today's responsible medical bodies, it could have far-reaching consequences for treatment. We can detect and understand in the content of young girls' and boys' fantasies the self-protective measures they seek to defend against sexual intrusion, be it in reality or in fantasy, in the wish to become a boy or, reverse, a girl, in any case to change role and become a member of the other sex to feel more safe. Freud makes this very clear in his paper on masochism, Ein Kind wird geschlagen in German. He describes a complex process which is difficult to resist simplification and reductionism, and easily lends itself to crude healing measures as trans operations in the knowledge of the advanced medical skills. Conclusion and taking up the threads. What then of the complexity of sexual matter in the case descriptions of the candidates today gets taken up or avoided, articulated, put into words and written about, or not in their reports for supervisions? Would the universality of the Oedipus situation, according to Freud, and I quote again, only conditionally dependent on the surrounding social conditions, still be an issue, be relevant for understanding? Is the centrality of sexuality in its relatedness to the sexual drive still recognized? And in this context, the importance of masturbation in adolescence with the specific content of the masturbatory fantasy for the, in itself over the years, for development by taking hold of on specific features of the erogenous body, as we have seen in Dora, a point that Laufer strengthened with his context of the central masturbation fantasy. Do we still recognize its important meaning for sexual maturation in adolescence? And does it get taken up and worked through in the analysis? Sexuality, human sexuality, I maintain, needs longitudinal studies. In a recent conference on neuroscience, someone made the remark that psychoanalysts understood very little about sex. That may be so, and I tend to strongly recommend the introduction of a course on sexology in our psychoanalytic training programs. But what psychoanalysts do know about is fantasies, and they should make use of this knowledge in their consulting rooms to the benefits of their patients' cure. With the technique of free association on the part of the patient and the use of evenly suspended attention on the analyst's side, we rely on language alone. No pills, no hormone manipulation, no changing sex operations on the body. We could think that we possess what it takes to treat the above symptoms if paid attention to the fantasies and those behind, and behind, and behind. Possibly, it is an assumption today, under the influence of the object relation theories of Melanie Klein and others, it is less dangerous to talk and write about aggression than about love and desire, autoerotic love and masturbation. The level of intensity and sophistication that our psychoanalytic technique has reached today including picking up pre-verbal body communications into transference, countertransfers analysis, may have as a downside a decline in being able to speak explicitly about sexual contents. Whether the observed disappearance of sexuality of some of the case reports of the candidates today is related to such processes or similar experience, that is, whether there is a price that has to be paid when working in dense transference, countertransference relationships, is a matter of further discussion, and we might want to pick it up later on today. There's also the fear of border transgressions, accusations, and the Me Too debate. Freud's J'appelle un chat, is that still happening? The spark. As training analysts, we have to think about how to listen and speak with the candidates on their own sexuality. They must be given the room to investigate freely. Otherwise, the tendency to avoidance of the sexual material is reinforced. Their desire vis-à-vis their training cases needs to be brought into their analysis and understood profoundly, and there's a risk for transgressions. This point has been raised in relation to border violations with patients, but I think it has a more general relevance related to what we do. How to find ways not to evade the subject of sexuality between patient and analyst, candidate and training analyst, when it is considered too dangerous. How to keep the spark of eros alive. It is what the patients come to us for in their depressions, their anxieties, and their compulsions. They have a right that return to them with a spark, only to then help them further on doing the painful work of renunciation, that their own wishes will not be fulfilled with this object of desire, the analyst, just as had not been possible to be fulfilled with their primary object, the father, the mother, the siblings, the grandfather, the grandmother, uncles and aunts, the objects of early infantile sexual desires, the family, the Oedipal constellation. It is still today the place where the most frequent transgressions take place. This does not mean that desire is bad. To the contrary, it is a spark of life, derivative of the life drive that we are not allowed to deny to our patients out of inhibitions and fears coming from our own unresolved neurotic Oedipal conflicts. I added a last sentence that is not in the Spanish translation.
Yo agregué una oración que no está en la traducción en castellano y se las digo ahora.
We have to learn as psychoanalysts how to foster a process where sexuality would involve yet another body part to meet the genitals, and that is the heart. To
The
that,
heart?
the heart, corazón. ¿No?
Está silenciada, Vivi.
Tenemos que ver cómo psicoanalistas logramos albergar no solo la genitalidad, sino la capacidad de llegar al corazón del otro.
To that we need. Thank you.
Muchísimas gracias. Wow. Bueno, we asked four candidates to ask specific questions before the meeting today, because they have in common that they are or have been the editors of the Motion magazine. That is the magazine that we annually write together as colleagues. Okay?
Yes.
So the first question was made by Paula Galak and is: the place of sexuality in the
Excuse me,
candidate.
let me find her on the screen, then it's easier
Can
for
you
me
say
to
hello, Paula?
relate. Hello.
Good voice. Do you see her?
Yeah.
Excellent. The place of sexuality in the candidates' reports is the same as in the clinics and in the current psychoanalysis. The supervision reports are a sample of what is happening today with sex in psychoanalysis. We live in a time where the veils have fallen. There is so much explicit consumerist sex and so little libidinal sexuality, so little personal involvement. There is an euphoria in sexuality and its consumption versus the dysphoria in sexuality and desire. We live in a time in which what is repressed is love, unlike other times where what was repressed was sex. Our patients are us too. Sexuality does not appear in them, and in us, sexuality really changed, and along with the bodies, and along with it, the bodies have changed. Did the substance or the form or the shape change?
Yeah. Well, I can only say that I agree with you, and we can discuss further details, but certainly you raise a very important question that is also in my paper. In the background, can words, can fantasies, or can social processes like the media change the material stuff, so to speak, that we're dealing with in sexuality, and that is the functioning of the body. But these are very big questions, and yeah, maybe do you expect me to go into all points, or shall we first gather the 4 points together and then I will comment and then...
As you wish.
Okay.
Okay, so mientras tanto, lo que contestó es que está de acuerdo con lo que pregunta Paula, que podemos discutir y entrar en más detalles sobre lo que hablaba, que su pregunta estaría incluida en su paper, que si pueden las palabras, las fantasías y los procesos sexuales cambiar el material del paciente. Y qué tiene que ver eso en relación con el funcionamiento del cuerpo. Ahora le voy a leer a ella las otras 3 preguntas por pedido de ella, que prefiere contestar las 3 juntas.
Perdón, Vivi, lo que habría que avisar es que en el chat está la pregunta de Paula puesta. Porque en español, para que los chicos sepan que la pregunta de Paula está en el chat.
Okay. The next question is by Juan Buccheri. Juan, you can say hello so she can see you. He looks like Freud. But say hello.
I have not found him. Could he wave?
Hello.
Oh.
Ciao.
Hello.
I don't speak English very well. I speak Italian. Okay.
So you are Juan.
Welcome. Thank you very much for your conference.
We love you, Juan. Bueno, Juan asks, I would like to ask you if the fact that you remained...
The analysts. The analysts.
I would like to ask you if the fact that you remained silent, avoid, or omit to talk about sexuality implies great resistance from the analyst himself, which puts in check the entire process of psychoanalysis and the approach to the patient's suffering. Because by silencing the sexual aspect of childhood sexuality,
Las fantasías.
there is a risk of silencing the instinctual conflict, the sexual and aggressive conflicts, which constitute what is repressed, which is precisely what disturbs people's health. Furthermore, silencing sexuality does not silence the transference, preventing us from using the most powerful tool for psychoanalytic work. So, what or how do you suggest working, thinking, studying, either in institutes or supervisions to reverse this trend?
Yeah. Thank you. Well, what do I suggest? I suggested already. First step is to bring back into awareness that sexuality is a very, very powerful force in the individual and in society, and that we must not precisely step in Sigmund Freud's footsteps, but what we can go back to, or back is the wrong word, we need to go forward. That's something that I made very clear. But what we must not put to the side or forget is the power of the sexual drive and everything else that emanates from this. And there has been a trend in psychoanalytic theory and practice that had a strong influence on what had a strong leaning towards explaining psychic disturbance from traumatic experiences. I would not want to deny the impact of trauma on the psychic structure, but I think we have to be very careful to not by focusing on the traumatic effect, forget the very intricate, very fine, very subtle workings of unconscious and conscious manifestations of sexuality. So that would be my first suggestion, that we pay again more attention and are not so ready to attribute certain phenomena and symptoms to traumatic influences, but rather see them in their intermingling with sexuality, and acknowledge that not to do that would be an evasion of a very, very difficult task that we are faced with, and that is the confrontation with sexuality, and not only confrontation with aggression. So that would be the first step. The second step was...
Can I there?
Oh, sorry. Yes.
No, thank you. I'm trying. Entonces, la primera cosa sería volver a poner la presencia sobre la fuerza sexual, que es poderosísima en el inconsciente y también en la sociedad. Que no necesariamente tenemos que ir tras las mismas precisas huellas que Freud, sino también ir hacia adelante, pero que no nos olvidemos nunca del poder que tiene la sexualidad como drive, como motor del psicoanálisis. Que estamos en una época donde hay predominancia de la experiencia traumática, y que ella no quiere minimizar el trauma, pero que no olvidemos lo muy intrincada y lo muy sutil que son las manifestaciones en el inconsciente de la sexualidad, que prestemos más atención a eso. Y bueno, y que es una mezcla entre ambas cosas, que lo que se produce más en la clínica hoy. Thank you.
A second point I made in my text is that we as training animals have to be aware of our responsibility vis-a-vis the candidates, and that we give them enough space to investigate their sexual erotic fantasies, impulses towards their own training cases, their own patients, and that we give room to that and do not evade the subject, as I when talking with candidates, frequently heard that they said their supervisors were not very helpful in these areas. They rather denied the problem or pushed it outside. They did not encourage them to write about it. They even warned them in some cases. They warned them to take a case to the final examination, which makes you member of the society.
ROTRAUT,
Yes.
you're saying that
sorry, I keep forgetting. Yes, I'm sorry.
You say that there is a selection of the case that the candidates choose in junction with the supervisor that avoids the usually sexuality?
Well, I didn't put it quite this way. I said that candidates reported to me, talked to me, or talked in groups of candidates and related that their supervisors rather avoided taking up the issues of sexuality, in meaning that they could freely express their own affectations by the sexuality of their training cases. So
Okay.
it could not be worked through, and if it cannot be worked through, it cannot be written about. So it gets pushed out of the representation, and then it looks as though it wasn't there.
Bien, entonces, thank you. Entonces, lo que dice como segundo punto es que como candidatos tenemos la responsabilidad, bueno, que tendrían ellos la responsabilidad de darnos el espacio para investigar nuestras propias fantasías sexuales y eróticas en relación a los pacientes, y que no esquivemos el bulto, no lo dijo así, lo dijo mucho mejor, pero que nos metamos con los temas que nos comprometen como candidatos y que tienen que ver con la sexualidad. Que pareciera que los supervisores no habilitan el espacio para que podamos trabajar estos temas en lo que nos pasa en la práctica clínica con el paciente, y que parecería que nos recomiendan mejor ir por otro camino.
Well, I think I made two major points. Sometimes I also heard that you have a choice to present from two cases that you treated as candidate, to choose one for presentation at the final so-called final examination, which is usually taking place at the conferences. We meet twice a year. So it is also the time when the candidates present their treatments of at least 300 sessions. They write up a report, they present it, it is being discussed. And the candidates told me that, or not only me, but in the group of that where we discussed, that sometimes supervisors discourage them to take cases where the sexuality played such a big role in the analysis. So another area where sexuality gets pushed out of the attention in the societies, and therefore in training. And it's something else where we can work on, that we bring it back. And I think it is very, very urgent that we bring it back, because otherwise we will leave out a major area of development in our society that we very badly need to understand. Sorry.
Dice que usualmente se presentan dos casos, para la examinación, para el grado de analista, o para terminar con la formación, que esto sucede 2 veces por año, que en general han sido 300 sesiones que se han compartido, y que lo que se presenta y se discute tiende a tener la sexualidad por fuera de lo que se está presentando. Es un poco parecida a la idea que estaba diciendo antes.
In my paper, I have a section and you might agree or not agree at all, where I suggest that even that the debate about trans could be enriched if we paid more attention to the fantasies of the children and adolescents who want to be changed in their sex. It is a big debate, I'm aware of this. I'm only suggesting that to me, it seems very important that in this area we follow Freud concerning the importance and the strength of fantasies, when the fantasies need to be used as a defense against very strong anxieties of children.
Entonces, lo que dice es que hay una sección en su paper donde ella sugiere que se haga un debate sobre la transexualidad que puede ser enriquecido si le prestamos atención a las fantasías. Ok, ahora Alicia, si quieres preguntar en inglés, a las fantasías de la sexualidad infantil que también están incluidas. Así que en esa discusión nosotros como analistas tenemos un montón para aportar antes de empezar con otros procesos como hormonalización y cosas así. We have one question that is from Nila Parente that Nila, maybe you want to say, wave your hand so she can see you.
Oh, hello. Okay, I see you now, yeah.
And I'll get a little part of her question, and then Alicia, that we know she speaks English too, so she will make the question by her own. Nila asks, what is present both in the analysis and in the supervision reports instead of sexuality? ¿Qué es lo que está presente en los informes de supervisión y en los análisis en vez de la sexualidad?
Is this your question?
Yes.
That is what it's parts of Nila's. She had more. In what way can writing be a facilitator of fantasy and a mediator of the act of discharge, since in contrast to sex as an evacuative act, it requires temporality?
It's temporality. Yes.
Well,
what takes the place of sexuality? It is often trauma. I mentioned that already, the concern with events, life events that are being considered as traumatic, without looking at the sexual dimensions that also can have and has usually. So another concern I'm having that I seem to be observing, but it depends on whether you share this perspective often or not. I notice a tendency towards more concretism, that again, more and more the life history, the tale of the life history of a patient is being too concrete, as it had happened in the same way as it's being talked about. And the dimension, what fantasy does with memory and with events is not elaborated enough, in my view. So that would naturally also lead to leaving out sexuality, because sexual life is, as somebody already in 2008, somebody wrote in a journal for sexology in Germany, wrote, the biggest sexual organ is between the ears, saying it is the brain which is the biggest sexual organ. It is imagination, it is fantasy, it is impulses that are transformed.
En el 2008, en un informe sobre sexualidad, alguien dijo que el órgano sexual más importante y más grande es el que está entre las dos orejas, que es la mente, la posibilidad. Respondiendo a lo anterior, dice que, que lo que estaría tomando el lugar sería la predominancia del trauma, que hay mucha preocupación con los eventos de la vida y que se desestiman sus dimensiones sexuales que están presentes, pero no en el contenido manifiesto, que no sabe si compartimos nosotros, pero que parece haber una tendencia a ser muy concreto, a saber una versión un tanto flojita de la vida del paciente, como si fuera que lo que dice es lo que pasó y lo que se deja por fuera es lo que tiene que ver con las fantasías en la historia, cómo se tejen esto para hacer una trama mucho más profunda y que podríamos trabajar más en eso. Alicia, would you like to ask in English directly? Alicia por ahí puede hablar en inglés. Igual primero te tenés que desmutear.
Well, I was coming back to Paula's question about how love is something more repressed nowadays, and sexuality is something that people can talk about, especially if it's out of the field of love. And something else that I wanted to ask you, if you consider genital activity as sexuality, or if sexuality is something that is always present in the brain, as you said, in our language, in our symptoms, in our desires, and I think sexuality is always there. But sometimes we don't talk in the same way that Freudian patients did, because we belong to a different time. And the risk of putting traumatic ideas instead of sexual fantasies is not a kind of a return to a pre-Freudian idea.
Alicia, la haces en castellano, ¿te animás? Y ya con esto vamos.
Sí. Bueno, hice un par de preguntas. Si Paula, la pregunta de Paula, ¿no? Que el amor está más reprimido que la sexualidad, que de la sexualidad se puede hablar sobre todo si está por fuera del campo del amor, ¿no? Y que la sexualidad está siempre presente en nuestros síntomas, en nuestras fantasías, en nuestros modos de decir, ¿no? Y en muchos lugares está la sexualidad más allá, no es solamente la actividad genital que... lo voy a decir, esto lo digo solo en castellano porque no quiero aplicar el cliché, ¿no? El amor es porque no hay relación sexual, dice Lacan. El amor me parece que es un valor que está un poco disminuido, ¿no? Pero está siempre presente. Y yo creo que la sexualidad también, ¿no? No en el modo en que por ahí los pacientes victorianos, las histéricas, pero yo valoro mucho el lugar de las histéricas y yo también pienso, I always think, ROTRAUT, that the question that hysteric patients do to themselves, which is, am I a man, am I a woman, is exactly the problem of transgender people today. That instead of the word answered or the listening or the talking cue, we use hormones and surgeons and things like that to solve that.
Entonces,
la pregunta es fast track answer, ¿no?
La pregunta es si soy un hombre, soy una mujer, en vez de tener una respuesta con palabras o con alguna construcción, pasa a ser más hormonal o intervenida. You, ROTRAUT, please.
Yeah, thank you, Alicia. Alicia has been very helpful in understanding and putting into Spanish my ideas, and we collaborate and are often, so far as I remember, mostly in agreement, maybe not always, but certainly on the importance of sex, of fantasies in general. This is something that is very particular to humans. And I think we put our light a bit too much under the, what is the saying? There's a saying in German, you put your light under something to cover the light, yeah, and then the light goes out. we put our light as psychoanalysts too much under that and extinct the light that we can develop as psychoanalysts in understanding fantasies. And we have a unique chance because we have the patients in our consulting rooms and they produce the fantasies, they tell us their fantasies if we encourage them to do so and if the place is right to do so. So we have a unique reservoir there to understand human nature. And as I said in my text, we should put it to use in order to help people in a different way than medicine or other faculties.
Nuestra responsabilidad entonces es poder iluminar aquellas áreas que aunque no parezcan, están hablando de sexualidad, darle la predominancia, no tapar la luz de la sexualidad en las intervenciones y en la creación para que nosotros garanticemos que estemos trabajando de esa manera, a diferencia de otros discursos como el discurso médico, por ejemplo. Rotraut, is there something you would like to say us? Just whatever. ¿Hay algo, Rotraut, que te gustaría decirnos a nosotros, lo que sea?
No, I would rather like to hear more from you, if that is possible, that you would make more comments, maybe on certain points of my paper, but also maybe not only that, also considering what you think the situation in your country is like. I described that we seem to observe a decrease in sexual activity already on the child level. I mean, they turn to the media, they turn to football, whatever, but they don't turn to the other sex to experiment. And then on the level of the adolescents, it seems to be a similar trend to turn away from sexuality because it is too threatening.
A mí me gustaría escuchar más de ustedes. La sensación que me da donde yo estoy es que los chicos están cada vez más preocupados por jugar al fútbol que ir a conocer a una chica, y que lo mismo pasa en la adolescencia, pero si hubiese algo que quieran compartir sobre su práctica o alguna pregunta sobre la formación, estaría encantada de contestarlos porque es un diálogo que quiero tener con ustedes. Y si alguien lo quiere hacer en castellano, lo puedo traducir.
You may have very different experiences in your country. I would not know, but I can say from Germany and some other European countries that we observe this trend, and it is something to think about as analysts when our science is based on the idea that neurosis comes from an inhibition of sexuality. So what happens to our society if sexuality is being inhibited in a new way, in a different way, not by paternalistic morality, but by other factors in society that I named, overstimulation, etc.
¿Está disminuyendo por una moralidad, por otros motivos? ¿Por qué sería que está apareciendo menos en la práctica? ¿Tiene que ver con otros discursos? ¿Qué piensan?
Bueno, yo quiero hablar, yo estoy en México, yo estoy formándome en APC en Córdoba, y ahorita una de las cuestiones que yo me preguntaba era, y creo que los analistas ahora no preguntamos sobre sexualidad con los chicos o las chicas, creo que más bien cuando viene el tema, a lo mejor entramos al tema, pero si no aparece, es algo que usualmente no solemos preguntar. Y ahorita pensando en esta cuestión del trauma, o sea, pareciera que cuando aparece algo que tiene que ver con eso, sí lo reducimos un poco más a lo traumático y no preguntamos sobre las fantasías que puede haber alrededor de eso, ¿no? Como que nos quedamos en la cuestión de la realidad material. Creo que eso cierra para que pueda haber como una conversación más allá, a profundidad, sobre las fantasías, ¿no? Que pueda haber, ¿no? Digo, lo veo como
This probably is going to be our last question of the day because of timing, but probablemente sea la última pregunta de la fecha. Pero bueno, Gabriela Sainz, that is from Mexico, but is training herself in Córdoba and was just speaking, says that, that we don't ask about sexuality, and that if it doesn't appear in the manifest content of the patient, we don't get in there. But we do that with the trauma effects, and we tend to reduce it by not asking about the fantasies involved. And that this closes the question more than opening and making broader place to work. She has... Thank you for laughing.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for putting this case to us to think. But I will not be the one to answer you in any kind of certainty. It depends very much on. First of all, your statement surprised me that you never ask about sexuality, but these are different styles, and I myself have found it useful. When I treated an internet pornography addict, a young man, in high-frequency analysis 3 times a week, not to mention his sexual habits from my side at all for the first year. Out of fear, I would take the place of an intrusive mother who he had, in fact, and I was concerned he then would leave treatment. So there are considerations when you do not feel it wise not to mention it from your own side. But I would not think then that this means it is not there, you leave it out. It was on my mind very much when talking to him that we were in a kind of moratorium to let him grow into a situation where he could be more trustful and more sure of himself, and then to address his sexual problems with his pornography addiction. And he did. So, yeah.
Dice, gracias por este caso, Gabriela, que lo que va a contestar, que lo que ella menos tiene es certezas, y por eso somos psicoanalistas, porque trabajamos el caso a caso, que sería interesante preguntarnos si realmente no estamos haciéndonos preguntas sobre la sexualidad para nuestros pacientes, porque es muy útil, que ella tuvo un paciente que consumía mucha pornografía en internet de 3 veces por semana, y que durante mucho tiempo, los primeros 2 años, para ella no ser la madre intrusiva que el paciente ya tenía, ella se restringió a sí misma de preguntar sobre sus fantasías sexuales, hasta que ella se animó y hasta que él estuvo más seguro de sí mismo para poder conversarlo. ¿Cómo estamos de tiempo, Matías?
Tenemos que terminar. Teníamos que terminar hace unos minutos, de hecho. Así que vamos a despedirnos.
ROTRAUT, maybe it's time to say goodbye for today.
Yes.
And thank you so much for all your help. I think this has been a very important meeting for many of us. Gracias por tu presencia. Creo que ha sido un encuentro importante para muchos de nosotros.
Thank you very much for your words. Thank you, Matías. Thank you also. Where are you? I don't see her anymore. Miraballes? Is she still there?
She had to leave.
Okay. So you give her my regards.
Okay.
And her thanks for preparing this. I'm very happy I could be with you and exchange with you. I feel that you took my comments from my paper in a very good way and seriously, and it made me feel good that because I feel I ventured into an area that, well, was not the beaten track. Let's say that. I made, as you might have heard, quite a big confession to be a Freudian and remain a Freudian in many ways, not disregarding other approaches, but to my mind so far, he has been the strongest force in promoting that sexuality, the sexual drive, is a very powerful factor in everybody's life. That the individual,
sorry, I have to, because I can't retain so much.
well, I don't have to continue. I get carried away a little bit in my homage to Sigmund Freud, but I said the necessary and so.
Les quiero agradecer mucho la lectura, comprensión y lo bien que tomaron lo que yo dejé por escrito y cómo lo tomaron y lo pensaron para la propia práctica. Yo me he confesado una freudiana en primera instancia y así me he reflejado en este encuentro. Y gracias por venir. Thank you, ROTRAUT. Thank you so much.
Muchas gracias a todos por acompañarnos, and thank you very much, ROTRAUT, for your presence and your words and your experience. It's very helpful for us.
Muchas gracias. Vielen Dank. Auf Wiedersehen.
Auf Wiedersehen.
Gracias.
Auf Wiedersehen.
Gracias, Cultura.
Muchas gracias a todos.
See you in Lisbon.
Gracias.
Yeah.